So we've been looking at the book of Esther in our evening meetings under this overall title of God Behind the Scene. We've now worked our way through the entire book, and I want to spend this final evening just gathering together a few threads which I hope will be interesting and helpful for us. I'm doing this under the overall thought of Esther being a distinctive book. And I'm going to divide our time together into three sections, all beginning with the letter S. So I hope that's convenient for us. First of all, we're going to remind ourselves of the story of Esther. Second, we're going to have a look at what I'm calling the supplements to Esther. In other words, how the book was added to quite early on in early translations, but also more recently in films and books of the story. And then third, we're going to have a final moment thinking about the significance of Esther for us as Christians today. So story, supplements, and significance. So first of all, then, the story of Esther. Now, in our very first message on this book, if you were here and if you can cast your mind back, we said that when it comes to reading the book of Esther, it's helpful to think of truth in three dimensions. Remember this triangle: history, literature, and theology. So Esther is history, we said, and the accounts recorded in the book are based on occurrences in history. On a few occasions during this series, I've shown us some images of ancient, what are called bas reliefs. Bas relief is a sculptural technique in which the figures or the designs are slightly raised above the background surface of the stone, and they're very helpful for historians. They help set a book like Esther in a particular historical context, and historians are able to reconstruct something of past cultures and events, even though they're quite two-dimensional. I recently came across a very short video which creatively animates some of these reliefs, which I found fascinating, and I thought you'd be interested to see it. So now is an ideal moment. So here we go. There you go. That was an image that we saw earlier on in the book of someone coming into the king's presence and with the scepter and so on, and the people waiting around the king and the like. So, but anyway, how cool is that as a video? Better than any Pixar or anything. So the book of Esther records real events that happen to real people living in real places. We can look at it, as we have done, at a historical level. But that history is written up into a story. And as we see, in the book also works brilliantly as a piece of great literature with characters and settings and a plot that's told from a certain point of view, which, like all good literature, is enjoyable and suspenseful and funny occasionally, and uses irony and draws us into what's going on. So Esther is history, but it's mediated through a well-crafted story. And it's through this combination of historical events written up as a story through which the book then gives us its theology. Or if you're put off by the word theology, just think of the word message. In other words, what the book says about God and the way God works in the world. History, literature, theology, and how the three go together. Now, we'll come back to the significance of the book, the message of the book, towards the end. But for the moment, I just want to remind us of the story as it unfolds in the book. So very briefly, we jumped into the start of the book with its theme of a dangerous empire. Beginning with three parties, you remember. It's an empire, we said, which is inescapable which seems invincible and which looks impressive until you take a closer look. Because then in the rest of chapter 1, we thought about Vashti, a defiant queen. We saw the queen's refusal to parade her beauty in front of the king's drunken male associates, and we looked at the king's response in banishing Vashti from his presence, which of course was the very thing that she wanted anyway. And then chapter 2, verses 1 to 18, tells us of a demeaning contest. A proposal is made that a new queen be found for Xerxes, and then the writer introduces us to two characters who will take center stage in the book, Mordecai and Esther. Esther happens to be young and beautiful and wins over the king, who makes her into his new queen. And then at the end of chapter 2 into chapter 3 shows how a deadly conspiracy unfolds. Mordecai, you might remember, foils a plot against the king. But where we might expect Mordecai to be honored, a man called Haman is promoted instead. And what seems to surface here in the book is a long-standing hostility between Haman's ancestors and Mordecai's ancestors. And Haman's anger against Mordecai is turned against all the Jewish people in the empire. And an edict is put forward for all the Jews to be killed and annihilated on a certain day later in the year. And that brings us to chapter 4, which we see is a defining moment. There's a back and forth dialogue between Esther and Mordecai, in which Mordecai urges her to use her position to intervene with the king, even though it may cost her life. And that leads to chapter 5, which tells of a decisive step. Both Esther and Haman, you might recall, have issues that they want resolved, and both make plans, but there's a contrast between Esther's patience and Haman's petulance. And that brings us to the real turning point in the book in chapters 6 and 7, a dramatic reversal with Mordecai's reward and Haman's retribution, all apparently as a result of the sleepless night, do you remember, on the part of the king. But the story isn't over yet, because the threat of death still hangs over the Jews. Roll on chapters 8 and 9, which describe a definitive salvation. So what we see in chapter 8 is the writing of an edict to counter Haman's earlier edict. And what we see in chapter 9 is the outworking of that edict for the rescue of the Jews from the threat of death. Salvation announced and salvation accomplished. But it's not enough to win the victory. The victory also has to be celebrated. And so the book ends with a designated celebration with the institution of the Jewish feast of Purim, an annual remembrance of the great rescue. But while Haman is bigged up, Mordecai rather is bigged up, the book ends on a slightly downbeat note by returning us really to where we started, with the might and glory of the Persian Empire, with Xerxes still exercising power in his own interests. So that's the story as we've seen it unfold over the series. And I hope that if you've been with us, that makes sense. But just to embed this further, I thought it'd be good to give us a break from me and for us to watch the video on Esther produced by the Bible Project team. And this actually is a really good job, I think, of showing how the whole book of Esther is built around the theme of reversal. So we'll play this together, and hopefully that will help us embed the story even further.
The book of Esther is one of the more exciting and curious books in the Bible. The story is set over 100 years after the Babylonian exile of the Israelites from the land. And while some Jews did return to Jerusalem, remember Esther and Nehemiah, many did not. And so the book of Esther is about the Jewish community living in Susa, the capital city of the ancient Persian Empire. The main characters in the story are two Jews, Mordecai, and then his niece Esther. And then there's the king of Persia, who's something of a drunken pushover in the story. And then there's the Persian official Haman, the cunning villain. Now, this is a curious book in the Bible, maybe for the fact that God is never even mentioned, not once. Which might strike you as kind of odd, because it's the Bible about God, but this is a brilliant technique by the author, who's anonymous, by the way. It's an invitation to read this story looking for God's activity, and there are signs of it everywhere. The story is full of very odd coincidences and ironic reversals, and it all forces you to see God's purpose at work but behind the scenes. Let's just dive into the story. The book opens with the king of Persia throwing two elaborate banquet feasts that last a total of 187 days. And it's all for the grandiose purpose of displaying his greatness and splendor. On the last day of the banquet feast, he's really drunk, and he demands that his wife, Queen Vashti, appear at the party to show off her beauty. She refuses, and so in a drunken rage, the king deposes Vashti and makes the silly decree that all Persian men should now be the masters of their own tongues. Then he holds a beauty pageant, and he wants to find a new queen. Really bad soap opera. But it's right here that we're introduced to Esther and Mordecai. Esther hides her Jewish identity and enters the beauty pageant and wins. And the king is so obsessed with Esther that he elevates her to become the new queen of Persia. And after this, and even more serendipitous, is the fact that Mordecai just happens to overhear two royal guards plotting to murder him. And so he informs Esther, who in turn informs the king, and Mordecai gets credit for saving the plot. Now, right here from the beginning, God's not mentioned anywhere. But this all seems providentially ordered. What is it that God's up to? You have to keep reading. We're next introduced to Haman, who's not actually a Persian. He's called an Agagite. He's a descendant of the ancient Canaanites. Remember 1 Samuel chapter 15. The king elevates Haman to the highest position in the kingdom, and he demands that everybody kneel before him. Well, when Mordecai sees Haman, he refuses to kneel, which of course fills Haman with rage. And when he finds out that Mordecai is Jewish, Haman successfully persuades the king to enact this crazy decree to destroy all of the Jewish people. And to decide the date of the Jews' annihilation, Haman rolls the dice. A die is called Pur in Hebrew. That way of look. 11 months later, on the 13th of Adar, all the Jews will die. Haman and the king then have a drinking banquet to celebrate their really horrible decision. So the focus now turns to Mordecai and Esther, who are the only hope for the Jewish people. They make a plan that Esther is going to reveal her Jewish identity to the king and ask him to reverse the decree. But approaching the king without a royal request is, according to Persian law, an act worthy of death. So in a key statement, Mordecai is confident that even if Esther remains silent, that deliverance for the Jews will arrive from another place. And then Mordecai wonders for love. He says, who knows? Maybe you become queen for this very moment. Esther responds with bravery. She purposes to go to the king with her amazing word. If I perish, I perish. Now, when what unfolds, we watch the ironic reversal of all of Haman's evil plans. So Esther hosts the king and Haman at a first banquet, and she says that she wants to make a special request for both of them at an exclusive banquet the following day. So Haman leaves the banquet totally drunk, and he sees Mordecai in the street. He fumes with anger, and he orders that a tall stake be built so that Mordecai can be impaled upon it in the morning. It seems like things can't get any worse for the Jews and for Mordecai. But all of a sudden, the story changes. It just so happens that night, the king can't sleep, and he has the royal chronicles read to give bedtime reading, and he just happens to hear about how Mordecai had saved the king's life. He had totally forgotten. So in the morning, Haman enters to request Mordecai's execution, and the king in that moment orders Haman to honor Mordecai publicly for saving his life. So now Haman has to lead Mordecai around the city on a royal horse, telling everyone to praise him. But this moment in the story is a pivot for the whole book. It begins Haman's downfall and Mordecai's rise to power. Watch those words. The day after is Esther's second banquet. So the king and Haman arrive, and Esther informs the king that first of all she's Jewish, and second that Haman has enacted a decree to murder her and to murder Mordecai, who saved his life, and to murder all the Jews. Now the king's had a lot to drink, so when he hears this news, he goes into yet one more drunken rage, and he orders that Haman be impaled on the very stake he made in Mordecai. It's ironic and a grisly way of turning to get. Haman's execution, however, doesn't solve the problem of the decree to kill all the Jews. So the focus now turns to Esther and Mordecai as they make a plan to reverse the decree. They discover that the king can't revoke a decree that he's already made. So instead, the king commissions Mordecai to issue a counter decree. On the appointed day that all of the Jews were supposed to be killed, the 13th of Adar, now the Jews are ordered to defend themselves and to destroy any who plotted to kill them. Then Mordecai, Esther, and Jews everywhere hold banquets and feasts to celebrate this new decree, and Mordecai is elevated to a seat beside him. Eventually, the decreed day comes, and the Jews triumph over their enemy. First, they destroy Haman's family, and then any other Persian officials who had joined in Haman's plot. And then on the second day, they get permission to destroy any who plotted against them throughout the entire kingdom. This results in joy and celebration as the Jews are rescued. The story then tells about how Esther and Mordecai established by decree this annual 2-day feast on Purim to commemorate their deliverance from destruction. And the name of the feast comes from Haman's diet. Remember, Purim. The book concludes with a short epilogue as Mordecai is elevated to second in command in the kingdom, and we are told now with his enrollment greatness and splendor as the Jews thrive and fix up. Now, step back. Notice how this whole story has been designed. The story was full of moments of ironic reversal, but we can now see the whole story is structured as an ironic reversal, right down to the details. So the king's splendor and feasts and decrees are mirrored by Mordecai's splendor and feasts and decrees again. Esther and Mordecai, they first saved the king, but now in the end they saved all of the Jews. Then you have Haman's elevation and edicts and banquet that gets reversed by Mordecai's elevation and edict and banquet. And then at the center, you have Esther and Mordecai's planning scenes, and then Esther's 2 banquets that act as a frame around the greatest moment of reversal in the whole story. Haman's humiliation and Mordecai's exaltation. Beautiful. Another fascinating feature of this book is the moral ambiguity of the characters. There's a lot of drinking, and anger, and sex, and murder, of which Mordecai and Esther are part. Not to mention their violation of many commands in the Torah, like marrying Gentiles or eating impure foods. And so the story is not putting Mordecai and Esther forward as moral decrees, as if it endorses all of their behavior, but they are put forward as models of trust and hope in the king's dealing with God. And so the book of Esther comes back to that question with which we begin: why God is not mentioned. The message of this book seems to be that when God seems absent, when his people are in exile, and when they're unfaithful to the Torah, does this mean that God has done with this work? Has God abandoned his promises? And the book of Esther says no. It invites us to see that God can and does work in the real mess and moral ambiguity of human history. And he uses the faithfulness of even morally compromised people to accomplish his purposes. And so the book of Esther asks us to be willing to trust God's providence even when we can't see it work, and to hope that no matter how bad things get, God is committed to redeeming his world. And that's what the book of Esther is all about.
There you go. Hope you enjoyed that. Good 9-minute summary of which I hope as well reflects some of what we've seen and thought about throughout the book. So, with the basic story in mind, let's come on to our second area for this evening, which is the supplements to Esther. Now, the version of Esther that we've looked at was originally written in Hebrew, possibly the 4th century BC, but then in and around the 2nd century BC, so not terribly long after the book was written, it was translated into Greek. So it could be understood by Jews who were dispersed around the Greek Empire at the time, as many of them no longer spoke Hebrew. So the whole Old Testament, including Esther, was translated into Greek. And this Greek version of Esther was expanded at various points. In fact, the Greek translation of Esther adds 107 verses to the overall story. The overall story has 167 verses, so it's quite a significant chunk of stuff that's added. And these are clumped into 6 major editions that are known as the additions to Esther. Very original. And this version of the story is found in what's known as the Apocrypha, which you might have heard of. and it's included in Bibles used by Roman Catholics and the Orthodox churches, but was never accepted as authoritative by Protestants. But the big point for us to note here is that the Greek translation of Esther, which expands it, includes explicit references to God and paints a more pious picture of Esther and Mordecai. So just as for instance, one edition comes before the Bible story even starts and describes a vision that Mordecai has. Mordecai is like a Daniel in exile who receives this vision right at the very start of the book, which prefigures what's going to go on in the story. And then in another place, the Greek version inserts a prayer of Mordecai after Esther agrees to go to the king. So I've got a flavor of it here. So then he, Mordecai, begged the Lord, remembering all the Lord's works, and he said, Lord, Lord, King who rules over all things, for everything is in your power, and there is none who opposes you when you want to save Israel. And now, Lord God, the King, the God of Abraham, spare your people, because they look upon us for destruction, and they desire to destroy your inheritance from the beginning. Do not disregard your portion, which you redeemed for yourself from the land of Egypt. Now, just to be clear, that's not in the biblical book that we know as Esther. It's in the Greek translation that was made a couple of hundred years later. The Greek translators wanted to make sure that we understand that Mordecai really was a man who feared the Lord. And then following Mordecai's prayer is a prayer of Esther. And she asks for courage as she approaches the king. So here's a portion of her prayer. And she, that's Esther, petitioned the Lord God of Israel and said, My Lord, you alone are our king. Help me, the one who is alone, not having a helper except you, because my danger is in my hand. I've been hearing from birth in my paternal tribe that you, O Lord, took Israel out of all the nations and our ancestors from all their forebears for an eternal inheritance, and that you did for them everything you promised. And now we have sinned before you, and you have delivered us into the hands of our enemies, because we glorified their gods. And once again, there's no moral ambiguity here in this version, but it tells us more about the translators than it does about Esther. They were determined to turn her into a good Jewish girl. And a little bit later on, she prays this: Remember, O Lord, make yourself known in the time of our affliction, and encourage me, O King of the gods and master of all dominion. You have knowledge of all things, and you know that I hate the splendor of lawless ones and abhor the bed of the uncircumcised, meaning the king's bed, and of any alien. And your servant has not eaten at Haman's table, and I have not honored the feast of the king, nor have I drunk the wine of libations. O God, the one who is mighty over all, hear the voice of the despairing, deliver us from the hands of evildoers, and deliver me from my fear. Now, if that was in the Bible, that would preach. But it's not in the Bible. Just to be clear, it's not in the version of the book of Esther that the Spirit chose to inspire. And there are all sorts of other little additions here and there throughout the Greek translations of Esther. For instance, when the king can't sleep in chapter 6, the Greek translation tells us that the Lord took sleep from the king, but it's not in the book. When Esther is about to confront Haman at the second banquet, we read that God gave her courage, but it's not in the book. And so in all sorts of small and large ways, the Greek translations of the book expand and supplement the original Hebrew in a way that includes explicit references to God and turns Esther and Mordecai into models of faith in a way that they're not in the original book, you see. Now, another source for seeing how the story of Esther was supplemented are the Jewish Targums. Targums are rabbinic phrases, or paraphrases rather, of the scriptures. They're written in Aramaic, and they were used by Jewish communities in synagogues and for study. But a little bit like the Greek translations, the Aramaic Targums often included additional material to try to explain what was going on in the text. And once again, it gives us insight into how Jews interpreted Old Testament books. And like the Greek translations, the Targums also expand on the book of Esther. So in one case, the Targum gives Mordecai's refusal to bow to Haman an interesting spin. The Targum tells us that Haman had an image of a god on his chest. And so if Haman bowed down to Mordecai, it would have been idolatrous. But again, it's not in the book. One of the Targums also says that Haman wanted his daughter to enter the contest and marry the king. But she was prevented from doing so. And in one case, Esther tells us why. Esther prays, and this is in the Jewish Targum, Haman wanted the king to marry his daughter. This is Esther speaking. Thus, when the maidens were assembled in the custody of Hegai, Haman's daughter was there, and it was determined from heaven, from God, that each day she became defiled with excrement and with urine. Her mouth also smelled exceedingly offensive, whereupon they hurried her out. And for this reason, Esther says, it fell upon me to marry him. Talk about providence. But again, it's not in the book. So again and again, you see, the Jewish Targums felt the need to insert additions to try to make the spiritual message of the book more explicit. And that has carried on over the years. You know, up to more modern times, there have been many cartoon and film versions of the book of Esther over the years. So the early black and white silent era produced several films in the 1910s, followed by a few others in the 1940s, and then a young Joan Collins took the lead role in Esther and the King in 1960. You'll see there up in the top left. And in that film, Mordecai begins the story as one of Xerxes' advisors. And Esther in that story is engaged to a Jewish soldier named Simon. But Esther's abducted into the king's harem on her wedding day. So in 2006, One Night with the King there, which you'll see, Esther feeds her pork lunch to the monkeys in Xerxes' garden and woos Xerxes with Bible verses. And those episodes, again, come from the Jewish Targums. So often when the films have been produced, they actually draw on the traditions from the Greek translations and the Jewish Targums. Once again, the films expand and supplement the book, as films and TV shows tend to do when they present Bible stories, to fill them out or place a slightly different spin on them, perhaps even with good intentions. So apparently, I've not seen it, but the Veggie Tales version of Esther, which is down there at the bottom, in the Veggie Tales version, the Jews aren't at risk of being wiped out. They're simply in danger of being exiled to the island of perpetual tickling. Maybe it would be better to be killed and annihilated. And for those interested in romantic fiction, looking around, see if there might be any here, there are no end of books on Esther to choose from, just 10 examples that I found there for us. So Joan Wolfe's book there at the top, fourth one in, A Reluctant Queen, contains Mordecai's dream that's there at the start of the Greek translation, and also portrays Esther's struggle to reconcile her position in the pagan palace with her religious convictions. Now, we could go on and on and on, and maybe I've already said too much. We give loads of examples, but hopefully this is enough. What we see again and again is that interpreters of Esther, both ancient and modern, not only supplemented the story, but they've adjusted the story. And in particular, they've adjusted it in a way that brings God more directly into the story, and which shows Mordecai and Esther as models of faith and piety. But it's not just books and films that do this, so do devotional guides. I read quite a few of them as I prepared for this series. And for several of them, I was putting crosses in the margin in writing, no, that's not in the book, because they were simply importing ideas into the book of Esther, which simply weren't there. I won't give you any examples. But if we read Esther looking for explicit references to God or for examples of godly characters, we end up doing the modern equivalent to what the Greek translators and the Aramaic Targums have done. We have to expand the book and supplement the book in order to make the characters less ambiguous. And that's often done with the best of intentions. But ironically, we end up being in danger of not doing justice to the book as God has chosen to give it to us. So as one writer suggested, just like Esther herself, the book seems to have undergone its own cosmetic enhancements to make it more appealing than it might be otherwise. The rough parts are smoothed over, and the parts that might make us blush are given a U rating instead. All of which brings us to our third section this evening, which is to say a few final things about the significance of Esther. One of the things, again, for us to say here is just to reinforce one final time, there is no mention of God or any of the names of God in the book, contrary to what the other translator and Targums say. God isn't addressed in the book. God doesn't speak in the book. There are references to fasting, but there are no references to prayer, repentance, worship, or faith. There's no mention of aspects of the Jewish faith, such as the covenants, the temple, the land, the Sabbath, the law, the Messiah, circumcision, purity, righteousness, or holiness. As we've seen right from the very start, readers struggled with that, and they tried to import God and faith and piety into the story. That's what we've seen in those early translations, right the way through films to children's cartoons, romance novels, and devotional guides. But that doesn't do justice to the text as the Spirit has chosen to inspire it. And what I've suggested throughout this series is that what the author has done is intentional. And instead of us trying to fill the blanks, we need to sit with the book, with all its curiosity and mystery, as it has come to us. Now, of course, we need to recognize that any interpretation of Esther is technically a supplement to Esther. In other words, every time we say more than the book itself says, we're expanding the book in some way. And that's what we've been doing, in a sense, over this series. Yeah. But the key is whether or not we're doing justice to the book as we have it, and as it's set in the story of Scripture as a whole. And as I said in our very first evening on Esther, I think there are two keys that help us unlock the book of Esther for Christians today. The first is the situation of exile. Just as a little reminder, here's a book that's set totally in the world of the Jewish dispersion. We're currently looking in our morning services at the books of Ezra and Nehemiah, which tell the story of what happened when God's people came back to the land and rebuilt the temple and the walls and reconstituted their lives around God's law and the covenant and so on and so forth. But what about those who stayed behind? Well, in part, what the book of Esther does is it gives us a glimpse into the dangers that the people of God might face in a situation of exile. And that's why a second key to the book is crucial, which is the salvation of God. Because although God himself isn't mentioned, the book speaks volumes about the providence of God for the deliverance of his people. In other words, in spite of the dangerous world of the dispersion, and in spite of the people's many flaws, God's protecting hand delivered the Jewish community from the threat of annihilation. And as we've said, as we've gone through the book, there are different views about how just compromised Esther and Mordecai are, and those subsequent translations try to resolve that, but that's to miss the point, because the real hero of the book isn't Esther and isn't Mordecai. The real hero is God. And so at the end of the day, I would like to suggest to us that the book speaks to us of God's presence. God's presence is a major theme throughout the Bible, from walking with Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden right the way through to the book of Revelation. But what about those moments when his people are far away from the land, far away from Jerusalem, far away from the temple? Is God with them then? And the book of Esther lets us know, yes, God is with his people, even while they live in a foreign land under a foreign power. The book also speaks to us of God's rule. The book starts off, you remember, with that impressive display of a powerful ruler over a vast empire, and yet there's a real king whose rule is far more powerful than anyone could imagine, whose rule is unrivaled, who rules for all time and eternity. And because of that, the book speaks to us of God's providence. Like we said at various points throughout this series, with the eye of faith, we can see God's fingerprints everywhere in this book, with all the different twists and turns and reversals. And that gives great hope for all of us. The book also speaks to us of God's victory. God is the ultimate victor. We know from the book of Revelation, of course, that that's the case. We've been able to read the last page and we know how it will all end. But the book of Esther gives us a way marker on the way to that great victory and gives us the hope that not a single enemy will triumph against God. Of course, how God brings about that victory is significant. God chooses to bring deliverance to his people through a woman who serves as a mediator on their behalf, and through a man who had previously been despised and unrecognized, but is then exalted and elevated to a position of power. Does this remind you of anyone? And in different ways, both Esther and Mordecai point to what Jesus would do on our behalf. And for that reason, the book speaks to us of God's promises. Right from the Garden of Eden, with the promise that the seed of the woman would crush the head of the serpent, God has been working out his plan of salvation. That eventually, of course, comes into focus in one man, Abraham, and his family, who become a nation. But the fulfillment of God's promise of a rescuer, of course, depends on the survival of this people, a people who will, in good time, bring forth the Messiah, the Savior of the world, Jesus himself. That's why, of course, the passage we were looking at today in Ezra 9 and 10 is so crucial, because the very survival of the people is at stake, which means the survival of God's promise is at stake. And in that sense, the book speaks to us finally of God's grace. Because neither Mordecai nor Esther are squeaky clean characters, which is good news for those of us who aren't squeaky clean either. And yet this unfaithful people experience this incredible deliverance, which comes about through multiple and remarkable so-called coincidences, all of which lead us to conclude with the eye of faith that God was working on their behalf and preserving his people, even though they didn't deserve it. We can only conclude that the deliverance, when it comes, is solely down to God's grace and faithfulness to his covenant with his people. He's not just at work when the empires of the world fail to recognize it. He's at work even when his own people fail to recognize it. And that's grace. And in that sense, the book speaks to us of the gospel. It shows us that God cares more for us even than we will ever know and that we will ever deserve. And that's why the book points us towards Jesus, not just through the characters in the book, but through the story as a whole. The story, which involves so many reversals, points to the ultimate reversal of all, the death and resurrection of Jesus, through which ultimate salvation and deliverance comes. And so the book of Esther is a great comfort to us as we live in a world that doesn't own or acknowledge God, because it tells us that there is a God behind the scene and that we can live with complete confidence, knowing that our lives are never at the whims of the world, but are silently and perfectly being directed by the sovereign Lord himself. Amen.